And lastly, of course, I want to end this blunt thing on the movie that we've been waiting for two, I think going on 3 years, really. I want to say she was cast in like February 2016. So even in the process of making it, like Krasinski wrote A Quiet Place, then they put it together, made it, released it, and now it's been on DVD since like the end of summer, and we're finally to this now. So going into this, I wasn't really, like I said before when I reviewed it over the summer. The original movie isn't something that I like completely and totally grew up with, but I was very aware of. So at first it didn't have a whole lot of passion into this, especially since I wasn't quite into the blunt fandom quite yet. That was before I kind of completely turned around, but now it ended up being like one of my most anticipated movies of not just this year, but like a really long time. I came to notice the closer it got. It kind of subtly snuck up on me throughout time, so let's go ahead and go into that. Obviously, the great thing that I do like about this, and some people still seem to be making that mistake in the media, is the fact that it's actually a sequel and not a remake. I still see the word remake thrown around in its advertising in some outlets. They need to get their shit together, but and yeah, and the fact that it's not the giant time jump you would expect given the number of years that it's actually taken between this and the original, which is like 54 or something. So obviously the first one being in 1910, and then this one going into the Depression era, or the Great Slump, as they call it. And it's still kind of has that same feel because it's obviously not too far into the future, like I said, given how far they could have gone. But it still very much sets up that era of like, well, I guess one of the first things I noticed as far as the era goes is the way Jane is treated by the band guys the first time they see her, like when they notice like the stuff for like her charity work and her rallies and all that, and the first thing they say is that for your gardening club and stuff like that. So to sort of see that particular placement also, but going into that also the fact that she's living with Michael now, who is widowed and has been for the last year apparently. I can't remember if they actually specified how long it's been, but I remember him saying it was a rough year for them, so probably about that. And then, of course, he has children that they're both caring for, and naturally the interesting thing I liked about this also was how the kids are obviously in disarray, and there's obviously problems following the mother's death and all that, but I do like how, while Jane and Michael were sort of all over the place in the first movie, the three kids here, there is that disarray, but there's also like this sort of responsibility that they seem to have, particularly the girl. And it's sort of like this idea, they don't really go in that direction and blatantly stated, but I like to think that it's like the Mary Poppins influence, even though she's sort of, gone out of his head over the years, that there's still something that was within his parenting that he learned from her that made these kids a bit more responsible and manageable than they were as children. So I really like that a lot. Also, when you talk about the first one, I was really pleased that, and this might seem like a small thing, but I was really pleased that there's an opening credit sequence. Because a lot of movies, especially like big productions like this, don't usually bother with that anymore. But it definitely gave it that feel, that sort of, I really hate how much the word nostalgic is being thrown around lately, but I guess you could call it that if you want to. But the thing I really liked also, and I think I even criticized this about the first movie when I talked about it earlier, was the fact that we don't see her in the opening credit sequence like we do in the first movie, because I always felt like it kind of sort of dampened the impact of her initial big entrance in the original movie because we saw her in the clouds during the opening credit sequence. I like that this movie holds back and lets her have that grand entrance without anything coming before it. And it's just sort of like the paintings in the background of the opening credit sequence, but still has just as much impact. And so, as far as, she goes, obviously, not only is she the perfect casting choice, but Rob Marshall agrees, since he is literally like pretty much one of the main reasons that caused him to make it, apparently, was seeing her in the part. Otherwise, this may not have even happened. and there was like no other alternative, and that's pretty easy to see. This might be a bit, maybe seem like sacrilege to people who are, see Julie Andrews as this, godlike creature, particularly in that role, like many people. But I was actually watching the first one back earlier this week in preparation for this, and it was almost like, even though the first movie is like 20 years older than Emily Blunt herself. It was like 20 years before she was even born. I was watching Julie Andrews back and thinking about the fact that because the interesting thing here is the whole not a remake status. So it's like when you see an actress taking on a part like this that's been so iconic already with one particular actress and nobody else, your first thing is kind of like, well, yeah, but in a remake they can, shape it their own way and do their own thing with it and all that. And even though Blunt absolutely does do her own thing with it, it's a little different because it's not a remake, it's a sequel, so she is playing the same person that Julie Andrews was, like, exactly. So finding that line to where keeping in line with that but also doing her own thing is amazing. I'll never know how she figured that out, but she did. But the thing here also is the way that she took that approach and apparently didn't go back and watch Andrews, which seems awfully risky, like I said, when you're playing what's literally the same character and not just a variation of. But like I said, I think it does help that she, despite how Travers ended up feeling about the movie itself, her influence, instead of going back to watch the movie, was going back to the books instead, which still clearly works. And as far as her, not being Julie Andrews, there is the whole thing of, I was really so pleased when I heard this, because I know when like a first trailer or two came out, I knew some people that were like maybe not that into it, and they were really into the whole, well, if it's not Julie Andrews, I don't care way of thinking. But it's like, when you look into it and you see that Julie Andrews said that the reason she doesn't cameo in this movie like Dick Van Dyke does, it wasn't necessarily because the thing I was talking about where people seem distant to it, I saw some people say like, oh, I'll bet Julie Andrews wants to stay so far away from this because it's going to be that terrible, or something idiotic like that. But when she actually came out and said that the reason was that she didn't want to take away from what Blunt was doing at all and how it was her thing, because apparently the idea was for her to be the balloon lady that Angela Lansbury plays at the end. But Andrews like foresaw them saying, oh, there's the real Mary Poppins when they see her, and the fact that she had so much respect for Blunt and how she clearly had so much confidence in her that she didn't want that to take away what she puts into it. I think the fact that Andrews would say that herself kind of speaks volumes about not just the respect that Blunt has as an actress, but also just how perfect it is that she's in this role now. So going on further, I'll keep continuously coming back to Blunt, of course, but setting up this whole thing where the mother is dead, where obviously you're going to need to throw in some exposition, but the really fun thing and the great thing about musicals is that you can throw in exposition, but if it's in song and the song is effective enough, you can just flat out say exposition, but it'll still make the scene great. So you have this really heartbreaking song that Ben Whishaw has at the beginning. That's like it's the second song in the movie after the start with Lin-Manuel Miranda. But and the way it just sort of establishes that, it kind of makes you realize just how strong the songs are gonna be, not just by themselves, but in regards to how the story is told also, and that kind of really sets that up early. But obviously the songs will get much bigger, much livelier, much more colorful and all that. But I did like the way they sort of started off. They didn't feel the need to go big immediately, because even when we start with Miranda, it's not like huge or anything. His voice is, certainly, and like the second you hear Miranda sing, it's like you can just feel it's something great, even if it's downplayed. But that, followed by the Wishaw song, is a really nice lead into that. But of course we've got the Mark Shaman music, and he and Scott Whitman did the lyrics. So when you look at it from that perspective, we go into I believe the next number is The Bath, which is, I say, it's a good thing they didn't start off big, because then when they go big, it's not gonna we're gonna feel it. So, and they do that immediately with this. The funny thing is that as I was watching the bath scene, when they're in the bathroom, and like, you know, there's a dolphin that pops up and all that, and there's bubbles everywhere. Just that by itself, and her throwing things in that just seem to sink into nothingness. You already kind of got a sense, like, this feels like an instant classic scene already. Like, this is definitely a scene that would have been in the first one if they could have done the effects. And I didn't even realize that this is, like, the very, very tip of the iceberg of this scene. And so it's like, I'm already convinced this is an instant classic before they've even left the bathroom. I can't say I was expecting what was on the other side of the bathtub when they went in, but, yes, as I said, everything just gets very huge very quickly. And the thing about that also is the real connection, because when you see some cases like this where there's maybe a distance between director and choreographer, and how oftentimes they're different people, and there's still, you know, a sort of, you know, all the, you know, cogs and wheels and stuff are turning, but when you see that Marshall has, like, a huge hand in the choreography itself, he and one other person are credited at the beginning, you get a sense that there's much more of a cohesive thing here, and this full, like, it feels like a much fuller vision coming from that angle. And it's sort of like, I guess you could go as far as to say he basically comes off like a modern-day Fosse, even if his movies are significantly more family-friendly. That's still kind of the vibe I get from this, especially with how big and huge the numbers can go without seeming like it's this, you know, big cheesy thing. Everything just completely takes you in this way that's kind of really hard to describe. I was thinking about that because there were a couple of cases, like when there's in the middle of the animated sequence when they have the number on the stage, and you see Blunt go into this whole thing, and she's even got there's one time where she seems to even channel Catherine Zeta-Jones in Chicago, which, given the Marshall connection, makes sense. Not sure if it's an intention, but I felt it. So as I'm watching her, it's sort of like, I feel like I could be, you know, sort of analyzing this and saying, oh, this is a particular thing I like about this, and this is a particular thing I like about this. But I really couldn't do that. My brain just kind of went away from itself, just kind of shut down in the back, and all I could do was just stare at the screen in, like, total and complete awe, just the whole time. Because it's really, because this, another way in which this came in was the Triple Life Fantastic number, where it's like, what do you even say about this? Like, I'm sure critics are gonna write, you know, like, oh, the cinematography is fantastic, the choreography is amazing, Miranda has such a presence, but it's like, just saying that stuff really do this number justice? It's like, the best thing you can do is just sit back and let this number exist, because if you even try to describe what it is that makes this so great, you're gonna fall, there's no way you're not gonna fall short. It's like the words do not matter when you're trying to describe this number, or many of them, really. They're just sort of like a feeling in themselves. So that's, and like I said, it feels like the musicals are getting fewer and farther between, not just in general, but the ones that you can say that about. Where it's, like I said, you just really have to feel it. Like, you can't, it's not something you can really articulate much. You can try, but good luck to you. So, and even the little things, even things that you've seen before. Like, there's a number when they're on the stage in the music hall where Miranda does that thing where he rolls his hat down his arm and it lands in his hand. And it's like, obviously show people have been doing that since the beginning of time. But it's just, when I saw Miranda do it, it was like I could feel my eyelids, like, go all the way up and then back down as he did that. And it's this, yeah, and it's been a while since I felt like this after a movie. This is one of those movies where, like, your day is going to be better after you've seen it. If not your week, if not your month, maybe even year, I guess. That's why they released it in December, so you so you could really feel that. But, and yeah, I was talking about how some things you just kind of have to watch in awe. there's also obviously plenty of those moments where, like I said, even as somebody that's not like absolutely 100% in love with the first movie, which I do like a lot, there are still some things, oftentimes callbacks, that just might make like every single hair on your body stand up. Whether it be when one floats down for the first time, or when even her saying "off we go," like even if it wasn't that great transition into the big underwater scene, just kind of her delivery and her saying it just in itself feels like this really special thing. And then when they first go into the animation, that transition, where it's, and I may have made this comparison when I talked about the first movie, but it does remind me a lot, and I think that also has to do with the intentional dreariness that like London has before we go into the animation. It always reminds me so much of the first time we see Munchkinland in The Wizard of Oz when it transitions from black and white to color. And it's like to find that magic again in a movie in 2018 is crazy. So, but this movie somehow manages to do that also. Obviously talking about the Sandy Powell costumes, of course. Just her name in general is synonymous with amazing costumes. But even so, the extra detail here, especially in the animated sequence, I particularly love Miranda's getup here, but also the way everything, including the costumes, just has that animated look to where if you look at the details on their clothes, they even look drawn, but still just stand out in this really fantastic way. And there's even some of the voiced work also, like Chris O'Dowd is the Irish whatever he was. I just remember laughing at the "yes, that's right, I'm Irish" line, and then I kind of lost what else he was saying after that. But even so, and even the way they also kind of, even though they do have 2018 technology, still some of those sort of transitions that sort of feel like they sort of stepped back and made it feel more classic, like how we don't see anything come to life on the wall before they go into it, how it's just a voice kind of talking, kind of almost feels like, a technique they would have used in the 60s as opposed to now. They would have tried to do something more fantastical, but I like that sometimes it just feels down enough to feel like it's still in that same world that we knew back then also. And as I was saying also, another comparison I wanted to make when I was talking about that underwater sequence, how it goes from the bath to the underwater to them on the boat or whatever, the way it sort of keeps building, and this also happens with the Miranda number also that I was talking about, where it's, I was trying to think, and the only one that I really remember doing this in the first movie was the Step in Time number, obviously, where it just felt like it kept going and going and getting big. And just when you thought it was like, reaching its triumphant end, it would somehow have something more triumphant up its sleeve. And it just kept growing and growing and going on and getting bigger. And it's like, that's what a lot of the numbers in this feel like, whether it be the bath number or the light number, anything like that. And it's the fact that you can keep that energy going, because it's another thing where it's like, it's so early in the movie too, but the thing is obviously I try to avoid knowing too much and the advertising and all that stuff. So a part of me probably wishes I didn't know like Dick Van Dyke was in it and all that, but obviously Meryl Streep's in the opening credits. But the thing I'm getting at is when you do know this and you know what's coming, it's sort of like you're watching it and you're like, oh, how can they possibly top that? And then there's a number that's bigger, and it's like, how can they? And you feel like you're only halfway through the movie, and you're like, okay, surely this is going to run out of gas. Where can the movie possibly go after all of this great stuff? And then it's like, oh yeah, I forgot. Meryl Streep's about to be in this somewhere. At some point, Dick Van Dyke is going to dance in this. And it's like, you just sort of have to, you constantly anticipate something great that's coming, and it never feels like it slows down. Even when it does slow down, the movie is still totally like on, because after you have the whole animated sequence, that they even managed to fit an action sequence in a Mary Poppins movie that somehow does not feel out of place because it's so well done in the animated sequence, no less. But then once all that dies down, we get this number, this very, very soothing number that Blunt gives us as she's putting the kids back to bed and all that. And it's, I mean, not only is Blunt just have a voice straight from heaven, but also the way it sort of transitions us from these without it feeling like we're getting too much at once, but still the quality is constant, because even when it's downplayed, it's still some of the best stuff the movie's offering. But the thing about that song is it obviously works in this moment just fine, but it's when it finds a way to come back later, and when it comes back in the context that it comes back, is just totally and completely heart-shattering in an unexpected way. And it's like when you hear the lyrics, you should have known that's the context the song would eventually be used in, but even so, it's just, yeah, it just goes straight into the heart and, like, pulverizes it, but you love it anyway. So, and so that's, and obviously, you know, the production design is totally insane as well. Obviously, they've seemed to have recreated a lot of stuff, but then there's also new stuff, like a scene that sort of seems to, somewhat, in a way, sort of, especially in the structure it fits into the story, sort of mirrors the laughing scene in the first movie, is the street scene with the upside-down room. But it's all this stuff. This is one of those movies that you just have to watch, and you're like, even if you know, like, a whole bunch of behind-the-scenes stuff, and you watch, like, some B-roll stuff or whatever, you still kind of wonder how exactly this is pulled off, or at least where was the starting point in creating something like this. And it's like you can't even imagine it in any other form but its full entirety, which is amazing. And obviously Blunt just has a full command, like, doesn't even, like, there's always kind of the risk that she's going to be a bit overshadowed by all the great stuff here, but she's, like, such a commanding center, even in that way where, like, as I talked about this with probably many things, but The Devil Wears Prada most recently, where she has a way to even just say, like, one or two words, and it's just, like, so impactful, even if it's meaningless in the grand scheme of things, like when we got the whole subplot going on with Miranda and Emily Mortimer's characters that sort of feels a bit superfluous, but then as it goes on, like, the sweeter it gets. And it's also nice that they don't draw too much attention to it, to the point that it might almost seem pointless, but I feel like that's kind of what made it so nice, was that they didn't go to it too much, but it was there just enough. And she's watching them ride off, and she just, like, turns abruptly and says, "That's enough," and we end that. They're gonna be, when they do the, at the beginning of the Oscar ceremony, when they always start with a montage of movies, if they don't end it on Blunt turning and saying, "That's enough," they're doing something terribly wrong. So, going on that also, there is a moment where you talk about her taking over for Julie Andrews. There is, like, one line where she says two words that I felt like she just entirely embodied Mary Poppins. And maybe I'm, like, overanalyzing these two words, but I don't know. For some reason, it just struck me in this perfect way. It's when they go to the bank, and they're getting... this scene basically gets cut off because they get confronted by Colin Firth, but she walks up and she gives Ben Whishaw his briefcase and says, "You forgot this." And he says, "Thank you," and she says, "You're welcome." That's it. But just her saying "you're welcome." But the thing is, though, is that the way that she says it comes off in two different ways, where it's like, it's basically, as far as, like, "please," "thank you," "you're welcome" go, Mary Poppins sees it as, like, this obligation, like this duty, that you say these things in this particular context. But on top of seeming it like there's a duty to say polite things, there is that sincerity underneath it. Like he's truly welcomed for that. And it's like I said, I'm probably overanalyzing two words, but I just really felt like it embodied the character just in its entirety in that one teeny tiny line delivery. And to be able to do that on top of, you know, the big giant numbers, obviously I've talked about Blunt's voice, and the fact that she's most of the time next to Lin-Manuel Miranda when she has to do this. The dancing also is, like, otherworldly. So it's pretty much every possible technical aspect. I can't even imagine, like, I don't want to jump the gun or anything, but as far as the number of Oscar nominations this will get, because as I was saying, if you look at the statistics, the first movie was, like, so incredibly close to winning Best Picture, it's not even funny. Obviously, My Fair Lady seemed like the grander production and the thing they'd more go for, and is the movie that won and all that. But if you look at what won and what each movie won, the first Mary Poppins was so close to being a Best Picture winner. And I'm very curious to see what this does also. And I'm not going to get my hopes up or anything, but I do know that it went crazy at Guild screenings, and I can totally see why, so we'll see what happens. We'll be discussing that in, like, a few weeks anyway. So, yeah, I don't know if there's anything else I was going to say about this. I'm sure there absolutely is. I could probably talk about the whole damn thing. I mentioned Colin Firth briefly, who does make a very nice bad guy in the mix of this also. That really does kind of add to the story, too. It does seem like, after a while, when you add a bad guy into a movie like this, sometimes it might seem a bit like, whatever, but it like maybe shoehorned or whatever, but it all fits in very nicely, and the cast really could not be more perfect. So, yes, so I think that's going to be it for this whole segment. Before that, though, I did like if you're here specifically just to hear about Mary Poppins, this can be when you like leave, if you want to, because I'm just gonna wrap up this blunt segment real quick with one thing I did want to mention that I kind of wasn't sure if I was ever going to or not. I was just going to review Mary Poppins and then end this, but I might as well, because I do tend to get questions about it, particularly recently, where some people think it's crazy how, when you look back in some old videos, I'm sure, as well as if you just know me, I, for the longest time, was not a fan of Blunt at all. Like, at all. Like, just at the sight of her, I automatically hated not just her, but the movie she was into. And as I've said throughout doing this all over again and revisiting after, getting some opinions changed along the way, clearly in a different place now, but it does seem a bit odd that it would just be like, oh, I saw Sicario, love her now. It seems very weirdly abrupt that I would make such a change. So you're probably thinking, is there more to it than that? Yeah, there is a bit more to it than just, I think she's an amazing actress, it turns out. And if you are aware of Blunt at all, you probably know exactly what that is. So, obviously, I'm probably just, I don't want to blow this up too much, because I am, like, just an insignificant one of, like, the hundreds of thousands, if not million or millions of people. They got really inspired and influenced when she started opening up about her childhood stutter. And when you think about starting from that and being where she is now, is really quite something, because I talked about this a little bit, because I don't really like to, when I talked about the perks of being a wallflower a year or two ago, where I've always had this problem, but I also had it terribly in school. We're talking like the whole time, from kindergarten to 10th grade, before I eventually dropped out. Which, the whole dropping out thing probably had a lot to do with this too, but it wasn't like a speech impediment, like a stutter or anything like that, but I literally could not speak. And a lot of people obviously thought that I was like, weird. Like I said, some people maybe thought I was a serial killer when we got up to high school. I don't know. And there was a lot of, I was the butt of a lot of jokes because of this. I was unlucky enough that the first Rush Hour was popular when I was in elementary school, so that line where Chris Tucker enunciates to Jackie Chan, "Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth?" I got that yelled in my face a few times. We were on a 5th grade trip, and one kid just flat out asked me to my face, "Why aren't you fun?" It's like, sometimes that still stings when it randomly comes back to me. And once again, if you know me, not only have I been dealing with that since forever, but I have this like whole dream scenario of being in the movie industry. And obviously that led to a lot of, like people are very supportive, and they're like, oh, that's really cool, and it's like, oh, you should totally do that. But it's usually accompanied with, how the hell are you ever going to do that? Because you can't talk to people. And it's like, yeah, so that has been plaguing me for a while, and was kind of like a huge confidence killer. So then, obviously, Blunt starts opening up about her stutter thing and how she was afraid to do anything like do plays and stuff like that. And you'll notice, like, and obviously I'm still carrying it even today, like I do have this, but it's like, you may notice, if you watch my videos, that my way of speaking is not exactly smooth. That's because despite how long I've been doing this, and the fact that I can talk about movies for this long, every single time I do this, it's terrifying. Like, every time I turn on the camera, I've got like a balloon animal in my stomach. Every time I turn off the camera, the first thing I say is, "That was terrible." And it's like, how will I ever let Owen upload this? But I just do it. So when I started hearing about her and realizing this somehow that she got from not being able to speak and having this fear of it, and having this fear of basically doing anything of that sort, particularly being on a stage and in plays and stuff like that. How she managed to get from that to one of the most sought-after actresses maybe ever. Because it's like, I mean, she's already just growing and growing and growing, and then obviously, you know, A Quiet Place was this really huge, magnificent deal. Obviously, you know, for its concept and the horror genre in general, too, but I mean, just looking at her popularity and how much it grows and how she has this incredible fan base, how there's, like, millions of people around the entire world that, like, worship her. And not in, like, you know, I'm sure there's the weirdos also, but I mean people that just really love what she does and feel so inspired by her. And how she got from one point to the other is, like, and obviously this is gonna, like, she'll be in the stratosphere forever because of this now, I imagine. And it's obviously all I needed to know for myself was that me being in a position in this business is not impossible. That's all. Maybe I will get there, maybe I won't, but the fact that it's not impossible is all I really needed to know, and that's what she gave to me. And ever since I've been, you know, a fan of hers now and going back and doing all this and seeing her as an inspiration, I've been not only writing more, but writing the stuff that I've been the most proud of that I've ever written. So it's like, so I'll just always be grateful for that, not just on top of the brilliant work that she's, like, constantly putting out on a regular basis now, but for that also, and just the fact that she is this... Yeah, here's the thing, this might seem like a bit of hyperbole, but the more I think about it, the more I think it's true. The great thing about her, for us, is that we're, like, living in this era that she is in, where we get to anticipate her performances and learn about, you know, the next movie she's going to be doing and get to see the performances as they happen, and that and the people that, you know, are in the business with her, that work with her, I'm assuming would say the same thing, where it's like, to be in the era of Blunt feels like this, you know, gift of sorts, where it's like 100 years from now when they're making movies, people look back on her and say, like, oh, I wish I could have worked with her, wouldn't it have been great to live in the era of her? I feel like that's the direction she's going, and that's the path that she's on. So, yeah. So it all comes down to that. So now we can end this for good now. We still have, like, a year and a half or something for Jungle Cruise, even though it's finished filming, like, 2 months ago. Which is a bit torturous, but surely she'll do something in between them, like maybe like a small thing or something. Like I said, the whole production of A Quiet Place happened between Mary Poppins starting and being released, so hopefully we'll get as much as we can. So, and as I said before, you can, all the other stuff is in this segment, the stuff that isn't in this segment, I've reviewed earlier, and there'll be links down there. If the links might be dead sometimes, given a copy and paste issue, I think. That's whole Owens thing, you have to... But they're out there if you search for them. So, yeah, so I think that's this whole thing. So, until whatever it is we do next, that's it for this.